A very warm welcome. You're watching Business Today. This is Rajat Mishra. So, Indian economy is dubbed as one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and also being one of the bright spots across the globe. There are multiple challenges that Indian economy is grappling with, from unstable commodity prices, rising interest rates across the world, and the fear of recession hovering over the developed economy. So, what would be the implications of all these things on Indian economy? To talk more about it, we are joined in by a very special guest, Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is a professor of economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst. So thank you, Professor Ghosh, for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, Professor Ghosh, without wasting much time, I would like to start off by asking you a very important question. There is one thing that Indian economy is one of the fastest growing economies. We are one of the bright spots across the world. So, according to you, how do you see this statement? And secondly, what are the various challenges and the various big concerns, serious concerns that you have for the economy going forward? And you can call it alarm bells for the Indian economy.
First of all, I would actually contest the idea that India is a bright spot in the global economy. I actually see the Indian economy right now facing many, many challenges. I don't see its immediate or medium-term future as particularly positive. And the GDP growth figures that we've got, I don't think adequately reflect the real changes in the economy, and particularly the fact that employment is still extremely depressed. Mass consumption, in all probability, is extremely depressed. And we're not really seeing the required changes in the most important sectors, in agriculture, in manufacturing, or even in construction.
Mm-hmm. So, ma'am, if I will ask you, can you just tell us 3-4 big concerns for you? You talked about unemployment, like employment opportunities are not created in enough manner. Then you are talking about agriculture sector is a concern for you, manufacturing sector is a concern for you.
Well, actually, the problem is really that we're not doing well, even in the things in which we were earlier seen to be relatively proficient and with a lot of potential. So first, let me begin by saying that one of the reasons India was so promising, one of the reasons we're in the BRICS, which was seen as the new emerging economies, is because of our population. Because the demography was such that more and more Indians would enter working age population. And that has traditionally been seen as a time when economies grow very rapidly. Of course, that really depends on what proportion of the working age population you can actually employ, whom you can generate productive economic activity out of. That is where we have singularly failed. And so I would say the biggest challenge in India today is productive employment generation. And if you look at the employment rate, which is the share of the working age population that is gainfully employed, that's not just incredibly low by global standards, but it's falling. And that is extraordinary because supposedly our GDP is growing very fast, which makes you think a little bit more carefully about how our GDP is currently constructed. But it's very rare to find economies where GDP is growing rapidly, but employment is falling. India is one such case, and it's been true now for a very long time. It's been true really from 2011 onwards. Of course, we have had major shocks. We've had demonetization, a badly implemented GST. Then we had the pandemic and the chaos created by very, very severe lockdowns, and the fact that we didn't get a strong fiscal response to counterbalance those shocks. As a result of that, we find that the majority of the population is actually probably facing worse conditions than they did even 3 years ago. We don't have data. Unfortunately, the government is not doing consumption surveys after having failed to release the one consumption survey that was done. But we do have employment data. And so the labor force surveys, insofar as we can get any real information from that, we find that employment is really not back to the levels at which it was even before the pandemic, which was abysmally low. We are one of the worst employers globally in terms of the share of working age population. We are terrible in terms of women's employment. Our recognized employment of women is below countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia at the moment, perhaps even Afghanistan. I mean, we're talking about that kind of dramatically low work participation. And that's not just a terrible failing, it is a very dire warning for our future. if we cannot take advantage of the demographic dividend, if instead it becomes a kind of time bomb because more and more young people are entering a workforce and not finding jobs, then that's a real problem. So I would say that's the first. The second big problem, and one that we don't talk about enough, is hunger.
So, ma'am, also moving on to the next question. We always talked about trade. We also always talk about exports. This government has put a lot of focus on boosting exports. So, traditionally, we always have had trade deficit, right? And in July this month, we had a trade deficit for all of $30 billion, which is one of the highest. So, according to you, how we can have a trade surplus? Because we traditionally we always have had trade deficit. Number one, how we can have a trade surplus. Second, do you think that the scheme of PLI, production linked incentive, is of any use or is going to benefit going forward the exports?
I'm all in favor of incentives or carrots, so long as they're also accompanied by sticks. I think the difficulty in India is that we have, at least, especially in the last 20, 30 years, we've been offering lots of carrots without any disciplinary sort of action. We don't put any conditions on those carrots. We don't actually make sure that companies deliver on what they're supposed to do. So that's one problem. But, also our trade is very unbalanced for another reason. A significant part of it now is in petroleum products. Private companies import petroleum now very cheaply from Russia, and then they export it, taking advantage, of course, of sanctions in the current case, but in the past, basically because of differential tariff and indirect taxes in different countries. So, if you remove the petroleum part, our situation would be even worse. So why are we enabling a significant part of trade that only benefits a few private companies? It doesn't benefit India. We are net importers of oil. We shouldn't really be exporting at all. And it doesn't benefit the people who are facing extremely high petroleum prices because of the taxes. So there's a significant part of trade which is messed up and which is not about the free market at all. It's all about differential rates that have been created by the fiscal regime, by taxes. And there is a significant part of our imports, which is gold. And gold is all about uncertainty. We claim it's for gems and jewelry export, but the amounts don't bear any relation to gems and jewelry export. So clearly, a large part of the gold import has to do with Indians falling back on the traditional saving device in the face of extreme financial uncertainty.
And then there are experts talking about China plus one, that India would be beneficiary of this, and many big corporations are looking at India as their home. So do you think that India will be the beneficiary of China plus one?
First of all, I think we have to recognize that the Chinese economy is now in a different league from India. We are giants in terms of population. We've just exceeded China in terms of population. But in terms of pretty much any other indicator, we are way behind. And we were not. 50 years ago, we were about the same. So we are now way behind. We also have to bear in mind that the trade patterns that we thought we would actually benefit, for example, when the US imposed sanctions against China in the Trump regime. In fact, we didn't. The real beneficiaries were the Philippines, Vietnam, a bunch of other Southeast Asian countries. We got very little of the promised investment that was supposed to come to China. And that's largely because we have not developed our own infrastructure sufficiently. We can't expect foreign investment to come when our own private investors are investing abroad rather than within the country. We need to ensure proper conditions for domestic growth by growing the domestic market, by providing adequate infrastructure, assured electricity, proper transport, not clogging at ports, and a whole range of other things. And particularly for the small, medium, and micro enterprises, we need to make the conditions to make them viable in terms of access to imports, access to markets, access to credit, all of those things. These are not rocket science. We've known that you need to do this for a very long time. Somehow we don't get it together to do this. As long as we don't do this, we will get the odd FDI coming in. But, Make in India in FDI terms has been a dismal failure. Clearly, that's been forgotten. Now the shift is towards Atmanirbhar Bharat. But that is being done in a rather knee-jerk fashion. In other words, the focus is on, particular areas where you can somehow generate some kinds of alternatives, instead of a much more strategic industrial policy, which is what many other countries in the world are doing now.
Right. And when we talk about trade currently, we know that current account deficit is a big concern. And according to the various estimates, we will end up this fiscal with $105 billion as current account deficit, which is a 3% of GDP. And also, we know this is riding on the back of a widening trade deficit. How do you see this current account deficit, and what would be the impact of it on rupee? And what is your assessment and outlook of a rupee going forward?
So the current account deficit is driven by the trade deficit, of course, which has expanded hugely, but also by the remittances, which have saved us in the past. It's really remittances have been more than all types of capital flow put together, which is why our current account deficit was not bigger in the past. But also by, don't forget, the balance on foreign investment. In other words, not the FDI, but what you're paying out in terms of dividends, returns on profit, and so on. And that balance has got progressively worse for us. So let's not forget that, FDI comes with a cost, and especially FDI, which is coming in for capital gains purposes, which a lot of it did really, can leave you with a larger deficit simply because of what you're paying out in terms of interest, profits, etc.
I know how bigger this worry is for you, like current account deficit as of now.
It is certainly a worry. It is certainly a worry. I think there are measures that could be taken on the trade account for sure. Very simply, I already mentioned petroleum exports. I mean, it's a bit of a scam, really, that we're allowing petroleum exports that just benefit a couple of private companies. Gold imports, very, very excessive. It's possible to think of ways to tax.
The government has already government has increased the import duty on gold just to sort of control the current account deficit. Do you think these kind of measures are important?
These are some of the measures. These are certainly some of the measures. We also have to worry about outflows increasingly because, in this more uncertain world, we are likely to face much greater volatility. As monetary policy tightens in advanced economies, all the emerging markets are going to feel the strain, and India is no exception. We shouldn't think, we're the bright spot, we're fine, because we're not. India is not an exception. We are likely to face headwinds, and we do have to actually start planning ahead for those headwinds. So that's absolutely the case. The rupee has been shored up right now because of RBI intervention. As you know, right? The RBI has been doing open market operations to somehow keep the rupee propped up away from the psychological barrier of 80. There is no doubt that that barrier will be breached in the near future. I mean, you cannot have a very large trade deficit, a large current account deficit, and global volatility in capital flows. And let's face it, not really very great prospects for your own economy, and expect the rupee not to depreciate. It will depreciate. And that in turn will generate inflation, and we already have a problem of inflation. These are all things you can see coming. The question is, does the government have a plan to deal with these?
And in the last few days, we have seen that states' debt has also become one of the biggest worry. And many reports have said in the backdrop of a Sri Lankan economic crisis, we need to look at and assess the kind of financial health of our states in India has. And even the RBI's recent report has flagged the alarming bells for the state, and 10 states have a very high fiscal deficit. So how do you see the state's debt, and what kind of regulation or a policy measure should be taken to control that? Or is it a worry, or is it not?
It is certainly a worry, but I would say that the fault lies squarely with the center. Because remember, why is the state's debt so high? Because a large part of what they were owed by the center in terms of legally compensation for the GST, if you remember, they were supposed to be given the equivalent of 14% increase every year, and the center was going to make up that shortfall. It was a legal commitment of the center. They didn't do that. What did they do? They allowed the states to borrow.
Right.
Instead of meeting their own legal commitment. So a lot of these states are in debt because the center forced them to be in debt. The center forced them to borrow instead of paying up what it owed them. And it can't then turn around and say, you're shocking, you're so badly managed, you're fiscally irresponsible. Frankly, it's an obscenity. And I find it extraordinary that the media that talks about state debt doesn't mention that the center reneged on its commitment to give the compensation for GST.
And when we talk about the states, that one thing that comes up is the freebies and the subsidies, free electricity, free water, that the state governments are juggling against each other to woo voters. So do you think that that is also a concern, and we should also draw a line somewhere on the freebies and providing subsidies, providing free electricity, water and everything?
If you are giving free water and free electricity at a minimum level to meet the basic needs of human life, I do believe it's the responsibility of governments to provide it for every citizen, which really means you have to make it free. So yes, I believe free water up to a minimum level, free electricity up to a minimum level is the right of a citizen. Okay. Thereafter, should be graded. In other words, it should then be like you have with electricity tariffs. The more you use, your tariff rate goes up per unit. That's reasonable because the rich can afford to pay more. A certain minimum, I think, is absolutely essential, and it's a human right for everyone. Having said that, let's just go into this thing about freebies. So what happens when you write off taxes for a sector for 30 years? Is that a freebie to that sector? The software industry in India benefited from a 30-year tax holiday. That's not a freebie. The corporates in India benefited from a significant decline in corporate income tax in 2019. If you remember, which was supposed to cause an investment increase. It didn't cause an investment increase. There was no increase in private investment, but it did cost us 1.9% of GDP. That's not a freebie. So how come a freebie is only something that the poor get? And the rich who are getting all these tax benefits and all these concessions, that's not a freebie. Number one. Number two, the payments to Kisan, the PM Kisan, which was lauded as a major achievement of the Modi government, was a payment of, I think, a relatively low amount of 6,000 per year. But it was just a random payment to every farmer. Yeah, that's not a freebie. It's a central government scheme, the same central government that is saying freebies are terrible. Okay. There are things which should be given as social protection. They're not freebies. They are social protection for people. And there are things which should be given as human rights. I would say, frankly, certain minimum food, education, I believe, should be public and free because that's the only way to ensure everyone has access to it. That's not a freebie if you have free schooling. That's necessary for any society. The most capitalist societies in the world have had free public education.
Right.
So the whole notion of freebie, frankly, I find it a little distressing. I find it hypocritical. And I find it completely wrong-headed in terms of how it views both economic rights and distribution.
And last question. We know the situation is volatile. Nothing can be predicted as of now in which direction the economy is heading and the global economy is heading. There are multiple things being played out in the backdrop. So my last question, MSMEs, this government puts sort of focus as the engine for growth. How do you assess the situation of MSME as of now in the backdrop of volatility, high inflation, and also rising interest rates?
You know, the condition of MSMEs is a bit like the condition of women in India. We get a lot of nice words from the government, and we get actions that destroy us.
So basically, you are saying that there are more things said than done by the government.
I'm saying that they say good things and they do bad things to us, both MSMEs and women in India.
Okay. So thank you so much, ma'am. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sparing time out for business today. And it was always a pleasure talking to you.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.